or PPG, which unites over 275 community organizations working to build a better Buffalo. Delighted to be joining you every Tuesday at 1 p.m. on Facebook Live and every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Power 96.5 FM and Mix 1080 AM. Today we'll be joined by Steve Halpern and Kathryn Franco from the Western New York Law Center. They'll be talking about how to get banks to better serve people of color and people with low incomes in the city of Buffalo and the region. Don't forget to follow PPG on Facebook and Twitter, and of course you can always get great information on our website, ppgbuffalo.org. The Public Good is sponsored in part by Univera Healthcare, real people who really care. And you can get videos from the Public Good, including our 3-minute highlight videos, on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. A few quick announcements for you before we get started. If you are at a 501c3 nonprofit organization, if you are part of a nonprofit organization and you're wondering what you can do in terms of advocacy, what you can do in terms of electoral activities, join me tomorrow, Wednesday at 12:30 p.m. at PPG's offices. We'll be doing a workshop on what nonprofit organizations can and can't do when it comes to advocacy and election-related activity. Tomorrow at 12:30 at PPG's offices. You can get more information and register at our website, ppgbuffalo.org. Also want to let you know that our friends at Squeaky Wheel have a new exhibit coming up. It's called The North is a Lie. It's about the myth of a tolerant and more equitable North and what that has done to communities who have suffered at the hands of that myth. The North is a Lie, it's called. It's an exhibit at Squeaky Wheel. It opens September site September 6th, 5:30 p.m. All right, with that, I want to welcome Steve Halpern and Kathryn Franco from the Western New York Law Center, talking to us today about banks and their role in fighting poverty and racial discrimination and segregation here in the Buffalo and Niagara area. Steve and Kathryn, thanks for being on the Public Good.
Yeah, wonderful.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sam.
So some of the statistics that many of our listeners know about Buffalo, they know it's the 6th most segregated metro in the region, and they might know that our population is very much underbanked and unbanked, that a lot of people who live in Buffalo and Niagara Falls don't have a checking account, aren't able to get loans through their banks, and that problem is especially severe for people of color. What can we do about it? Are there tools to get banks to do a better job in serving people with low and moderate incomes and people of color in our region?
There are ways of dealing with that occasionally intractable problem, Sam. The mechanism that we in the Buffalo Niagara Reinvestment Coalition have used is the Community Reinvestment Act, a national law enacted by Congress in 1977 for the really express purpose of ensuring that banks conduct themselves, wherever they find themselves, as good community citizens. The Community Reinvestment Act imposes requirements on banks to invest in specific areas in community development and loans, in low moderate income mortgages, in small business loans, and as well in the general area of philanthropy. And we here in Buffalo have been very fortunate to consummate 2 community benefits agreements, one with Key Bank and another with Northwest Bank, which run over a 5-year period of time and which involve commitments by those 2 banks in the aggregate to invest roughly $2.4 billion in this community in those 4 areas over a 5-year period of time. So that's the mechanism we've used in order to maximize the value of the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. We have formed a coalition of 11 community organizations who have bound together for the express purpose of working to collaborate with them to make the kinds of investments here in Western New York, in both Buffalo and Niagara Falls, that will benefit elements of our community that have historically been neglected by banks.
So Kathryn, tell us a little bit about the impact of these big agreements. So, and let's think about it just sort of as an ordinary neighborhood resident, someone who needs some kind of financial services. They want to cash their checks. They want to maybe take out a small loan. If they're not using the bank, how are they accessing those services? What kinds of places are they going to?
So that's a great question. One of the things that we often see, particularly in the areas where the CRA is really looking to have banks be doing their investment, and where our community benefits agreements are really having the banks focus. Here in Buffalo, it's going to be the east side of Buffalo. We know that that's an area where we can see kind of
The agreements are rather detailed. In the Key Bank agreement, for example, there are almost 50 specific commitments that the bank made in the 4 areas that I alluded to earlier. And I should note as well that we were able successfully to negotiate a Buffalo addendum to the National Key Bank Agreement, which, for example, committed Key Bank to build a full-service bank on the east side of Buffalo. We pressed very, very strenuously for that objective. It made its way into the agreement, and we fully expect that Key Bank will shortly begin work to construct such a branch. Northwest has already done that on Jefferson Avenue, and in addition to constructing a full bank branch Northwest now, there will also be a financial literacy center attached to that branch run by the Belmont Housing Council. So what we need to appreciate is that we were able to carve out for our city unique commitments that the banks made, and we are now in the process of working with both banks to ensure that they fulfill the commitments that they made.
So Key Bank is one of it's now, because it merged with Northwest Bank, that was sort of the occasion for a lot of this activity in urging them to do a community benefits plan. If they wanted to be able to affect this merger, the bank regulators said, well, there's some things you need to do, because at the end of the day, after Key and First Niagara merged, 2 banks really dominate Western New York, M&T and Key. And the regulators said, well, if you're going to have that big a market share, we need to make sure you're doing some things to serve the community. Mm-hmm. So there are, as you said, there are a lot of provisions in that community benefit plan that Key agreed to. Let's walk through some of the big areas. So did they make numeric targets for things like mortgage lending and small business loans and other banking activities?
Yes, they have. Now, but in both agreements, as I mentioned, cooperate with them whenever we can, and to prod them when they need prodding to meet those goals. We've also had, I should say, communications with M&T Bank, as most people fully appreciate, the largest bank in our region, and a bank which invariably refers to itself as our hometown bank. M&T now holds about 64% of all of the bank deposits in our region. Key Bank holds another 16%. So between those two banks, they're dominant in our area, and they hold a combined total of about 4/5 of all of the deposits.
So they're the big two. So Key Bank, there's already a community benefit plan, and the coalition is starting to talk to M&T Bank about making sure that it is fully serving low and moderate income people in neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color in Western New York. Kathryn, what is it like trying to monitor these big agreements? Is there a lot of work involved in making sure that the banks are doing what they said and that sort of thing?
Yes, I think that it's a great undertaking, especially when you're working with banks the size of Key Bank and even Northwest. But when you talk about that Key and M&T are the big players here, those are not just big banks in our region, but they also have a national footprint as well. So they're not just here in Buffalo, Niagara, but they're elsewhere across the nation. And so trying to go ahead and tackle what is happening specific to our area and getting that information out can be difficult sometimes, because even when you look at the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, so that's going to be public data where you can see what banks are doing specific to what the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, kind of pulled out and said, all right, the banks need to be reporting. The HMDA, that Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, that's going to be where you can get some of that information, but it's not always as specific as we want. So how we've talked about, we want to be looking in these low to moderate income areas, these LMI areas. That's going to be on our west sides of Buffalo, the east side of Buffalo. We can't always see some of the data that we want, so we don't always get to see specific geographic locations or specific to race. And I think that that was a great point that you're talking about, that the CRA and kind of the community benefits agreement really talks about income, so low to moderate income, but this really has a true intersection specifically here in Buffalo and across many other cities across our nation where we see the intersection with race and ethnicity. So I think that that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's often noted that the Community Reinvestment Act that regulates banks and urges them to provide more service to low and moderate income neighborhoods, it was enacted in response to redlining and to racial discrimination and segregation, but it actually never talks about race. It just talks about serving low and moderate income neighborhoods and customers. And so it's sort of on all of us to make sure that it gets used to address racial disparities and not just questions of income. So Steve, you've got these agreements that the coalition is monitoring. But in general, the Community Reinvestment Act that governs the banks and tells them that they need to do certain things, how do community groups and just ordinary residents go about in playing a role in getting that enforced? What are tools that people can use to get involved in that and make sure that the banks are doing their best?
Well, it's a good question, Sam, in that it's very timely. We just last week, announcement out of Washington came that the administration was contemplating fairly significant and, in our view, draconian changes to the rules governing the CRA. These proposed changes will be considered over the next 12 to 18 months, and that will necessitate involvement by individuals and community groups throughout the nation, and obviously in our city as well. And that will require communicating with regulators about these changes and indicating the undesirable consequences that we think will flow from those changes. And we at the coalition will be sure over the next coming months to communicate to our community, both here in Buffalo and in Niagara Falls, how individuals and community organizations can communicate with the policymakers in Washington about these proposed rules.
Mm-hmm.
So there certainly will be that opportunity and an important chance to influence any new rules, and perhaps to strengthen and improve the CRA. But we are told, and we have reason to believe this is the case, that the federal regulators listen to what people write to them. They listen to the communications they get from both individuals and community groups. So we are now moving into a period when it will be particularly important for us to mobilize, if you will, our community here in Western New York to speak to the proposed changes. And we at the coalition hope to be in the lead to educate folks locally about what they need to know and what they perhaps should do to effectuate positive changes.
You're listening to The Public Good. We're talking today with Steve Halpern and Kathryn Franco from the Western New York Law Center. They're also with the Buffalo Niagara Community Reinvestment Coalition, and we're talking about their work in getting banks to do a better job serving people of color and people with low and moderate incomes in Buffalo Niagara. So Kathryn, in the normal course of things, if someone has a negative experience with a bank and they think that the bank isn't doing a good enough job serving the underserved or marketing its materials that would be particularly helpful for people with lower moderate incomes or people in those neighborhoods, are there tools they can use? If they got in touch with the Law Center, would you have them write a letter to federal regulators or something like that?
Definitely. So what Steve was talking about with the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, the ANPR, this is a particular time where we have a comment period where we can go ahead and put those comments in and say what we want to have happen with this, but also no matter what, at any time, if you have a bank that is in your area, then that means that that bank under the CRA should be, or not should be, but has an obligation to your community to provide some public benefit. Yeah. So if you see a bank in your area, if you were to come to the Western New York Law Center, specifically looking out for the BNCRC, Buffalo Niagara Community Reinvestment Coalition, we would definitely be able to go ahead and help facilitate those commentaries, which go in, and this kind of goes a bit more into CRA, but essentially there's examinations that occur. So even if there's not an exam that's upcoming, you are able to provide that commentary, and then when that exam comes up, that's when they'll be looking at these specific things that are happening.
And I think the experience has been in the past that it doesn't take that many comments about a bank to get the attention of the bank and of the federal regulators. Not many people take advantage of this right, but when they do, it's very powerful because there aren't that many voices. So if you make your voice heard, it's going to be a powerful voice in the regulators assessing and the bank itself assessing how good a job it's doing. One theme that I know has emerged from the work of the coalition that we've been involved in together is that it's one thing for a bank to have a product, but it's another thing for the bank to really use that product. So there are a lot of good checking accounts out there, good small dollar loan products. KeyBank has a check cashing service that might be of interest to a lot of people, but it's not always true that they really market those products extensively or even train their own staff fully in those products. Have you had experiences of that, of going into a local bank and not finding the products or the services that you're looking for?
Yes, unfortunately we have, Sam. And when we have had those experiences where we've had members of our coalition, for example, visit local banks asking for products that the bank has told the public is available. Our experiences in multiple instances at different banks, those products are either not available or the people who should be in a position to know about the products and services and make them available to customers don't know about it.
Yeah.
So this is an area in which even where there appear to be products and services that are, if you will, consumer friendly to low and moderate income individuals and people of color, those products and services are not necessarily there, and we monitor that situation.
Yeah, so one, I think, message to consumers out there, if you're looking for different kinds of banking services, shop around, because banks offer quite different products. And then even within a bank, make sure that you ask a lot of questions and get the product that's best for you. Because, when it comes to a checking account, they might have 3 different checking accounts, and they might advertise very prominently 2 of them, but it might be the 3rd one that they don't talk so much about that's actually the best for you. So really urge people to be careful consumers when it comes to banks, and to think about our local credit unions as well, which provide banking services in a nonprofit capacity. So credit unions are owned by their members, and so they're not out to make a profit, and so sometimes they can provide services more inexpensively or in a way that's more geared toward the needs of the community than the banks are able to offer. So check out our local credit unions as well. Kathryn, I know one of the most typical problems that people have with banking is overdraft fees. And I don't know if you have looked at the question of overdraft fees and how expensive they are or how they get assessed, and whether you might have any thoughts or advice for people about dealing with overdraft fees.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting topic because overdraft fees can actually, for a bank, constitute a substantial amount of what they're bringing in. I haven't gone quite as far into it as I would like to, but when you look at a couple of line items, when you're looking at the banks and their annual reports, you can see that
they're actually making a lot of money on overdraft fees.
And sometimes substantially more than their others. So sometimes for certain deposits or other services that they're providing, their overdraft fees are exceeding what they're getting in other areas. So it is a moneymaker for them. And so what I think about in advice to give consumers would in part to be make sure that you are going in and you are making the most informed decision when you're looking at your different checking accounts and everything like that, because I think that that's one thing that people have mentioned, that they weren't aware of the overdraft fees that were going to come to them and how they would come to them.
Now, the banks offer a product that they call overdraft protection. And what that means is that if you do overdraft your account, they'll cover it, but then they'll charge you a fee, and those fees locally can range as high as, I think, $38.50 or something like that for each overdrawn check. So you buy an item for $20 and you go $5 over your account balance, you're then paying a $38 fee for that little check you wrote. So that's a very expensive way to borrow money from a bank, and I, for one, would certainly urge people when they're choosing their checking account to choose the option where you can't overdraw it, where if you try and make a transaction and you don't have enough money in your account, that transaction gets turned down. I know for some people they really want that convenience of being able to overdraw the account, but most people out there, they're overdrawing for pretty small amounts, and then they're paying really hefty fees for it.
And Sam, I just want to add that those fees vary and vary significantly from bank to bank. All the more reason for people, searching about for a banking account to explore the fine print, so to speak, very carefully.
Yeah. When someone does overdraw an account and then they don't pay it back, what does the bank do? So if you owe them money because you overdrew and then didn't replenish, I assume they close your account at that point?
Well, you can get another. I've seen it where you can also be given additional fees. So if you stay if you stay negative, then you can go ahead and get additional fees. So some have it where you can get fees by day.
Right.
And I haven't heard that it's closed. I don't know if that's your experience. Have you seen that, Steve?
No, I haven't, but I should say that the banking industry does keep very careful tabs on their customers who do overdraw, and then eventually people can find themselves in what's called the checks system, which effectively puts them on a kind of a blackball listing of people who cannot
open a new checking account.
Open a new account because of their past history. And once you're in that situation, then you really are forced to go into the poverty industry services that are available to people, which are even even more expensive. I should mention something
Yeah.
that relates to a question you asked earlier, Sam, and that is about community participation in affecting banking policies. In January of 2019, our coalition hopes to hold a community forum to which we will invite all of the local banks and the public, as well as regulators, in which we'll have a discussion about the performance of our local banks in servicing the low and moderate income community in our area and communities of color. So our hope is on that occasion to, in some sense, provide a report card to the community about the services of our local banks. I mean, you know, what is the old standard here, that sunlight is the best disinfectant?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we intend to shed some sunlight on the practices of banks so that they'll be motivated to provide a fair and more equitable range of services.
Fantastic. All right, believe it or not, we are running short of time. So for folks who want to learn more about the Community Reinvestment Act and local efforts to improve the services that banks offer to people with low and moderate incomes and people of color, urge you to check out the Western New York Law Center, and there is a website for the Buffalo Niagara Community Reinvestment Coalition. The BNCRC has its own website where you can learn more about the work of the coalition, and if you are a community group that might be interested in joining that work, you can learn more about how your group can join the coalition and get involved in this extremely valuable work that, as Steve and Kathryn mentioned at the outset, has already succeeded in bringing more than $2 billion in investment by local banks into Western New York. So some great work. Great to have you on the show, Steve and Kathryn. Thanks so much. Next week on The Public Good, we'll be speaking with Michelle Jones. She's an Open Buffalo Democracy Fellow. She'll be talking about her work in making Buffalo more equitable. Tune into The Public Good every Tuesday at 7 p.m. here on Power 96.5 FM and Mix 1080 AM, and every Tuesday at 1 p.m. on Facebook Live. Thank you.